All right, everyone. We are live. Let's do this. All right. Today I'm live on my YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like, really helps me out. And live on Twitter today for anyone catching this on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, make sure to check out the YouTube. I rarely do streams on Twitter. So if you like this content, check it out there. Going to be doing a read aloud today with my 3 articles I recently wrote for the 33rd team about my tournament winning best ball teams. For those who don't know me, my name is Liam Murphy. I have won 3 NFL best ball teams to date. That would be Best Ball Mania 2 on Underdog Fantasy for $1 million. I won the DraftKings 555 last year for $250K. And I also won the DraftKings $2,000 tournament for $50K. So over 1.3 million in best ball earnings. And make sure you guys hit that subscribe button. We're closing in on 1,500 subscribers here. The first mini goal of our account here. And going to be really just trying to read these articles for you guys. If you have questions, if you're on Twitter, I'm not seeing you right now. I can only see YouTube comments. What's going on, Adam? But not going to be pausing to take questions during the read alouds. Got 3 articles here. Just going to read them. And at the end, going to take a Q&A session for anyone who has questions or anything like that. So let's jump into this. The best ball winning team breakdown on the DraftKings 555 for $250K. And in the YouTube description below, I listed all 3 of these articles. So if you want to read these articles on your own time or you want to check them out later, feel free to do that. For the next 3 weeks, this series will provide a detailed breakdown of 3 of my best ball teams that have won tournaments over the past 2 years. These teams have won Best Ball Mania 2 for $1 million and $1 in 2021. And in 2022, the DraftKings 555 for $250K and the DraftKings $2,120 tournament for $50K, earning north of $1.3 million. Although those teams were successful, don't draw sweeping conclusions from them. Winning best ball tournaments, even if you're the best player in the world, requires conquering an insane amount of variance. Looking at all of the finals teams provides a bigger sample, but it's still just a sample that worked that year for that draft landscape and for that 3-week fantasy playoff sample. A brief note here, the draft landscape part is a part I do not see a lot of historical research touch on. I'm going to have some articles coming out on this, but basically, if running backs used to be if the first round used to be all running backs and now the first round is all wide receivers, literally this was the case in 2020. The first round had 1 wide receiver, Michael Thomas. This year it has 1 running back consistently there, CMC. You cannot just compare historical things like, well, we can start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, things like that, when both the players at the top is different from the draft landscape and the players at the bottom, when you can no longer get the Justin Jeffersons of the world, the Chase Claypools, if you would, the T. Higgins in the last round. Anyways, back to reading. Identifying patterns from winning teams is important, but be careful concluding that how these teams were constructed is how you need to construct winning best ball teams. Many different draft strategies can work, and drafting quote-unquote weird teams to be different from the field is a viable strategy. This is something I do a lot. This little paragraph here is really talking about, I saw a lot of people on Twitter be like, well, Pat's team started with 2 running backs, so clearly this is how winning teams are constructed. People saying that just have no idea about what they're saying, pretty much. It's what worked for that week, and we all know that week was even more wild with the Bills and Bengals game. Anyways, this part of the series will evaluate the winning $555 team on DraftKings. A note about the main difference between DraftKings and underdog structure is DraftKings is full point PPR, points per reception, and 20 rounds. Underdog is, for most tournaments, 18-round drafts and half point PPR. The winning 555 team, and I have an image of it here. I'll read off the players. It had Pat Mahomes, Christian Kirk, Saquon Barkley, Tyler Boyd, Breece Hall, Jahan Dotson, Michael Gallup, Khalil Herbert, Deontay Johnson, Trey McBride, Amari Cooper, David Njoku, Travis Kelce, Zay Jones, DJ Moore, Jerick McKinnon, Jamison Williams, Geno Smith, Kareem Hunt, and Jaylen Warren. The 555 Best Ball Tournament on DraftKings was around a 2,000 entry field. The group sizes of the first round, the playoff rounds, and their advanced structure and prize pool are attached below. So what this says is it's a $250K to first tournament. In the first round, it's top 2 advance out of a 12-person group. So this would be before the playoffs. Round 2 of the playoffs, aka the quarterfinals, was a 6-person field where only the top advanced. And then in round 3, it's a 5-person field, only the top 1 advanced. And if you made the finals, round 4, that was 11-person final. And if you made the finals and you won, which my team did, you got $250K. If you got last, you got $17,000 and $500 and whatnot here. Higher entry fees and smaller field size tournaments are generally viewed as more skilled. It's reasonable to conclude that you can win a 2,000 entry tournament more often than a 450,000 entry tournament. So like, obviously it's good news that me, Justin Herzig, Pat Kerrane won Best Ball Mania 3, but if some dude who fell asleep and auto-drafted his team won, that wouldn't be that shocking either, because it's just such a massively sized field. Back to the article. The team structure was 2 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 9 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. The team stacks included Patrick Mahomes to Travis Kelce to Jerick McKinnon, Kareem Hunt and Amari Cooper and David Njoku, and Christian Kirk and Zay Jones. The Week 17 stacks, meaning these teams played each other Week 17, included Chiefs and Broncos, 3 total players. They were all Chiefs. And some people wouldn't count this as a team stack where you only have 1 player of a team, but I do. If you draft 3 Chiefs and no Broncos, what you're saying is the Chiefs are going to beat the shit out of the Broncos, or they're going to score a lot of points. Seems logical. Anyways, Commanders, Browns, 4 players. Seahawks, Jets, 2 players. Bears, Lions, 2 players. Jaguars, Texans, 2 players. In total, 13 of the 20 players were stacked up in some way for Week 17. During the 2022 offseason, I targeted 6 defenses expected to be bad. So this is something I do too. I try to predict which defenses are going to be bad in fantasy football or real football and who's going to allow points. I thought the Seahawks, the Bears, the Lions, the Jaguars, the Texans, and the Jets were going to be bad defenses. Clearly, I was wrong about the Jets. I think I was pretty right about the other ones. In general, stacking and Week 17 game stacks are less important for the smaller the final field size. So with only 11 teams in the finals, it's a little bit less important compared to a 160-person final. However, if your opponents are also drafting this way, meaning they don't care about Week 17 game stacks, it's key to keep stacking to be different. So my take was, no one's doing this. I'm going to keep doing it. I think it's still important. It's my new edge, whatever. I'm pressing it. Week 17 game stacks are important to winning best ball tournaments. My Best Ball Mania 2 team would not have won without the Rashad Penny to Amon-Ra St. Brown mini stack. More on that later. Quarterback. At quarterback, I took Mahomes early, around the 4th, which allowed me to lean on the advantage an elite quarterback provides and wait for an unstacked Geno Smith around the 20th round. There's no way to tell when players are selected on DraftKings. However, Smith was roughly a 20th round pick. and he was the last startable quarterback to be drafted. So I vaguely remember this team, and I remember all the other quarterbacks were gone. Roll the dice on Geno. It makes sense to punt quarterback 2 if you're going to invest a premium pick in Mahomes. Smith ended up being a player I drafted a lot on DraftKings. He was on my winning 2K team too. Once it was clear he was the starter over Drew Lock. His outstanding season was unexpected, but the pick made sense to pair him with DK Metcalf when I drafted him, and Smith was the cheapest starter in best ball. Smith could have been more useful in underdog. However, the uncertainty of his battle with Lock early in the offseason made it a tough sell. So basically, I didn't draft Smith too much on underdog, where it's 18 rounds. But part of that had to do with the fact that I drafted most of my underdog teams before I knew who was going to be the quarterback there. Running back. This team featured Saquon Barkley, drafted in the 2nd round, and Breece Hall, drafted around the 5th round, a player I drafted a lot. With Barkley and Hall as anchors, Hunt was selected in the mid-rounds, and Khalil Herbert, McKinnon, and Jalen Warren were late-round picks. This gave the team 2 locked-in starters in Barkley and Hall. Hunt was a disappointment, but he could have provided several usable weeks on a team with an elite offensive line and questionable QB play. The 3 late-round running backs were home runs. Herbert provided many usable weeks in the regular season until he was injured. McKinnon was a player I drafted a lot in best ball last year. He was the chief starter during the 2021 playoffs. CEH didn't look overly impressive. McKinnon's usage was likely to come during critical late game weeks, and he stacks cheap with Mahomes on a PPR site. The Mahomes, Kelsey, McKinnon stack, and primarily McKinnon, is one reason this team won the tournament. Warren was a player I drafted a lot in late August after depth charts were released. A key thing I note here. Warren wasn't being drafted earlier in the offseason, low ownership, and therefore, in the playoff rounds, Najee Harris, the Steelers starter, was an expensive draft pick, and the field wasn't drafting any of the Steelers' backups. They couldn't figure out who to draft between Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland. However, both of those answers were wrong, as it should have been Warren. I'm so sorry, guys. We're going to have to pause this reload. I got window people here, and I thought they were set, but give me 5 minutes here, and I'll just edit this out of my video. Window guy just wanted to tell me he was done, so we're all set. We're back. Wide receiver. DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, Deontay Johnson, and Kirk were the team's 4 expensive receivers, likely costing picks somewhere between the 4th and 8th rounds. Funny enough, Moore, Cooper, and Johnson are not players I drafted a lot in best ball last year because I was lower than consensus on them and their passing game situations. Moore and Johnson made more sense on PPR sites versus half-point PPR because their fantasy points would come from catching passes rather than scoring touchdowns, I thought. With little exposure to these players, it makes sense to draft them in a high-stakes team as a hedge. So what I'm saying here is I didn't draft a lot of these players. I drafted more Mike Williams, Gabe Davis, guys I thought would score touchdowns. However, if I'm not going to draft a lot of these guys on a lot of my teams, I might as well draft them as a hedge where if I'm wrong, I want to be big wrong and profit from it. Cooper ended up having a great year with Brissett. Moore and Cooper also helped the team advance in the playoffs. They were they did nothing all year and then popped in the playoffs. And they scored the most points in week 17. Kirk is a player I drafted a lot in best ball. I was big on him. Unlike the others who made fun of Kirk for his record-breaking contract, if you remember on Twitter, people were like, oh, the Jaguars paying Kirk all this money. I thought Kirk was a talented wide receiver, and I wanted to bet on Trevor Lawrence. Christian Kirk was also on my winning Best Ball Mania 2 team. The rest of the receivers were Tyler Boyd, Michael Gallup, Jahan Dotson, Jameson Williams, and Zay Jones. Boyd is attached to Joe Burrow, and if Jamar Chase or T. Higgins got hurt, Boyd's contingent value is huge. Gallup was coming off of injury, but the Cowboys prioritized paying him over keeping Cooper. meaning they valued Gallup highly. And he was cheap. Dotson and Williams were rookies who earned expensive round one draft capital in the 2022 NFL draft. Drafting rookies is generally a good bet, as they tend to score their fantasy points when the money is made in best ball at the end of the year. Still, it's important to note the process is imperfect and worth resisting. Williams barely played this past season. Got to talk to the editor there. What I'm trying to say here, the process is imperfect and worth resisting. This is supposed to say revisiting. And what I meant by the process is imperfect is that I drafted these guys who were injured in Gallup and Jameson Williams, saying, I don't care, and maybe I need to revisit that. Williams barely played this past season, and Gallup was pretty disappointing when he did play. Jones was a mini stack with Kirk and far too cheap. Jones had a good year with the Raiders the year before, and it seemed likely he could be the number 2, or at worst, the top deep threat in an offense that was trotting out 32-year-old Marvin Jones as competition. Lawrence took the next step, and Zay Jones had a massive year. So yeah, Zay Jones, very cheap, with a pocket passer in Lawrence. Thought he was a great pick. Tight end. This team saw success thanks in part to the selection of elite tight end Kelce in the first round. Kelce ended up having a massive season, even at 33 years old. A side note, taking Mahomes without drafting Kelce in the first round would have been a mistake. I see this a lot. People just take these quarterbacks like Joe Burrow, Mahomes, and they don't get their pass catchers. That's not good. Taking high-volume passing quarterbacks without their top weapons is risky. David Njoku was drafted somewhere between the 10th and 12th rounds. He's athletic and had one of the top contracts for tight ends at the time. Njoku fit in nicely with the team's other Browns players in Cooper and Hunt, betting on the team. There was also a big drop-off in tight end quality after Njoku's tier in the drafts, so it made sense to get him before the drop-off occurred. Njoku had a good season, but wasn't that important to the team with Kelce taking most of the tight end production. I added Trey McBride as a third tight end. Drafting 3 tight ends is pretty normal for 20-round drafts. However, after taking Kelce in the first round, stopping at 2 is what most people would do. Still, there were 5 reasons I made the bet on McBride. 1, Zach Ertz is old and showing signs of slowing down. 2, the Cardinals often utilize tight ends under former coach Cliff Kingsbury. 3, there weren't any running backs or wide receivers that were great bets in the 20th round. 4, the Cardinals played the Falcons in Week 17, a defense I wanted to target. And 5, he wasn't being drafted often by the field. Key. So he provided playoff leverage, a.k.a., pretty simply here, if I'm the only one with Trey McBride and he does well, I'm the only one who profits from it in the finals when the money's made. McBride's upside made him a plausible selection in a number of drafts. He ended up having a disappointing season even after Ertz's injury, but in a strange twist of fate with David Blau as his quarterback, McBride scored a touchdown and 20 PPR points in Week 17, allowing this team to win a low-scoring affair. Don't you love when sharp preseason takes are paid off? So Trey McBride did nothing all year, and then he scored 20 points Week 17 and ended up being a big reason I won the $250K. Guys, if you have questions on YouTube, just drop them in the chat and I'll get to them after I finish reading them. Moving on here. Now we're on to my winning team, my winning 2K team on DraftKings. Going to end up with the Best Ball Mania 2 team and some takeaways of them. Wanted to say here before I jump into this team is on my YouTube, if you go under the video section, not the live section, where most of my content is live streamed, you will find the draft of this team. This is the first team ever that was live streamed and won a tournament. So if you want to see how the sausage was made, I streamed this draft back in August before it ended up winning the tournament. So super cool to be able to go watch that. I'll fix the thumbnail for that video, but it is listed below, or it is listed under my channel. So the $2,120, I'll call it the 2K team, best ball tournament on DraftKings included a 72-person field that paid $50K to the winner. The group sizes of the playoff rounds and their payouts can be seen below. This graphic also shows best ball contests with higher stakes entry fees often have a gentler advance rate in the playoff rounds. So this was after round 1, which was top 2 advance out of 12. It was round 2, top 3 out of 6 advance in the quarterfinals. Round 3, top 3 out of 6 advance in the semis. So 50% advance in the quarters and semis. And then round 4 is only a 3-person final where you're getting 15K, 25K, or 50K. And I ended up winning for 50K. My team structure included 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 8 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. The team was Trevor Lawrence, James Cook, White, Devonta Smith, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Logan Thomas, Michael Gallup, Geno Smith, Jerick McKinnon, Dameon Pierce, Mo Alley Cox, KJ Hamler, DeAndre Swift, Devontae Adams, Christian Kirk. Again, I guess Christian Kirk's been on all 3 of my winning teams. Tyler Conklin, Derek Carr, Michael Carter, and Gabe Davis. Rashad White. I was blanking on it. And these are the points the team scored. Obviously, these are not the points they scored in Week 17. This is probably Week 16 scoring. For my team stacks, all 3 of my quarterbacks got their top pass catcher, which is a dream scenario. So I had Trevor Lawrence to his best pass catcher, Christian Kirk. I had Derek Carr to Devontae Adams, and I had Geno Smith, again, to DK Metcalf. So I had Trevor Lawrence to Kirk, Geno Smith to Metcalf, Derek Carr to Devontae Adams, and then my other team stacks were James Cook to Gabe Davis, so running back wide receiver correlation, Michael Carter to Tyler Conklin, running back and tight end. This is more negative correlation where you're hoping one of them scores a touchdown in a given week. In total, 10 of my 20 players were team stacked. My Week 17 game stacks included Jets versus Seahawks, 4 players, Jaguars versus Texans, 3 players, Chiefs versus Broncos, 2 players, Tampa Bay versus Panthers, 2 players. I also had Carr and Adams go off for the Raiders against the Niners, 2 players, and the Bills versus Bengals, 2 players, which ended up being canceled after Damar Hamlin collapsed after making a tackle. A total of 15 of my 20 players were stacked in some way for Week 17 final. Game stacking for Week 17 is slightly less important for tournaments with smaller final fields. This one only included 3 teams, but I guess stacking is being done at a far lower rate by the field. What follows is a breakdown of my team by position again. I selected Lawrence and Carr in the middle rounds, 9th to 12th, to pair with Kirk and Adams. As I did in the DraftKings 555 for 250K, I took Smith at the end of the draft, Geno Smith, but this time to stack him with DK Metcalf, so even a better pick. If you don't have to overpay, pairing 3 good quarterbacks with their top pass catchers is a dream in best ball. Stacking your quarterbacks and your wide receivers, obviously, you benefit. Smith had a great season and was selected as the NFL's Comeback Player of the Year. Lawrence, without whatever his face is, the coach, improved significantly as the season progressed, Urban Meyer. And Carr to Adams provided plenty of spike weeks. That combination made these 3 quarterbacks good enough to combat the Jalen Hurts and Josh Allens of the world. Running back. I picked DeAndre Swift in the 2nd round. He was a player I drafted quite a bit in best ball last season because he was young. I liked the Detroit Lions offensive line and their offense in general. And they had a favorable playoff matchup, especially in Week 17 against the Chicago Bears. Smith was injured much of the season or vultured by Jamal Williams in the red zone, but he did score well in Week 17. I added Texans rookie Dameon Pierce around the 6th round. Pierce went from around a 12th round cost up to the 5th, 6th range. In general, I don't tend to draft a bunch of these players as I feel better teams exist with the player at cheaper costs. I'm open to revisiting this process since the market is good at identifying players who should rise in ADP. I didn't draft Pierce a lot in best ball, but I wanted a share of him on a higher stake team as a hedge. So again, this is me approaching my whole portfolio where if I don't draft a lot of a player, drafting them on a high stakes team or 2 as a hedge makes sense. After Pierce, I took 3 mid-round running backs with good upside: Cook, Rashad White, and Carter. Cook provided some good weeks in the fantasy playoffs, and White had a decent season splitting time with Fournette. Carter's season was pretty disappointing after Breece Hall went down to injury. I ended up again with probably the late round MVP draft pick in Jerick McKinnon of the Chiefs. McKinnon had huge weeks during the fantasy playoffs and finals. Wide receivers. 6 of my wide receivers were drafted early, so I stopped with only 8 total. A common mistake drafters make is to pick wide receivers early and then draft a lot of them. Instead, spend the extra picks at running back and tight end if you're going to draft a bunch of receivers early. In other words, draft like you know you're right. My 6 early receivers were Devontae Adams in the first round, Gabe Davis in the third, DJ Moore in the fourth, Metcalf in the fifth, Devonta Smith in the seventh, and Christian Kirk in the eighth. Drafting Adams, Metcalf, and Kirk allowed me to backstack my quarterbacks with their primary pass catchers. So sometimes, rather than taking a Travis Kelce when Mahomes is already gone, where you're not going to be able to stack them, sometimes it makes sense to target these pass catchers with quarterbacks that go later in the draft so that you can stack them. Adams had a huge season, helped by injuries to tight end Darren Waller and receiver Hunter Renfrow. Davis and Moore seasons were a mixed bag. Davis showed spike week potential, but they came the wrong weeks, and he likely was battling an ankle injury all season. DJ Moore had a terrible fantasy regular season, but a great playoffs. Metcalf, Smith, and Kirk had huge seasons and were far too cheap because each of them had quarterback concerns, according to the market. My last 2 receivers were Gallup and KJ Hamler. Both had quarterbacks I wanted pass catchers from, I thought, but both receivers had disappointing years due to injury. Tight end. I punted the position and then took 3 during late rounds. When I punted tight ends, I often pick 4 tight ends to try to make up for the lack of quality with quantity. Conklin was my best tight end, which doesn't say much about this group. Conklin and Logan Tom, and keep in mind, 4 tight ends, only something I'm doing on 20 rounds usually. Conklin and Logan Thomas were 2 late round tight ends I drafted quite a bit because I thought they had decent upside potential. However, Thomas battled injuries much of the season, which at his age 31 isn't shocking. Mo Alley-Cox was a tight end the market felt had decent upside, but I might have only drafted him once last year on this team. I thought the Colts would continue to utilize 3 tight ends, and that's exactly what they did. If you're going to totally punt off a position, tight end makes sense because they score the fewest points. If you have a wide receiver or running back who scores 30 to 40 fantasy points week 17, you can live with your tight end scoring 5 points. Okay. On to the last team. Thanks for sticking by with me, guys. This is going to break down my winning BBM2 team and the similarities with the 3 teams. If you would, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, really helps me out. All right. I was introduced to the best ball world after winning Best Ball Mania 2, BBM2, an underdog for $1 million in 2021. Reviewing the team allows me to share the draft board from my winning team along with the team itself. So Underdog, unlike DraftKings, provides you this info to break down. So you can see that it was a 156,000 person tournament. It had $1 million to first. Second place got $250K. Fourth place got $100K. BBM2 was nearly a 155,500 entry contest. These quote-unquote flagship tournaments are classified as large field lotteries. Yes, it takes skill to win, and it's a good sign the past 3 winners are sharp fantasy players in myself, Karain, and Herzig. However, there's a lot of variance in these types of tournaments compared to a smaller field. It's also just how top-heavy these contests are. First place got $1 million, and fourth place finisher got 10%, or $100K. I posted my draft board here. I am team number 8 here if you want to come back and look at that and how the other teams drafted. The draft board for the winning team can be seen above. My team was number 8, and the one starting with Jonathan Taylor and Aaron Jones. The team was drafted in mid-June. It's nice to know that you can win a contest without other drafters doing weird things, such as taking Brian Hoyer or another backup quarterback in the 3rd round. So That's something I hear people be concerned about sometimes. But if you look at this draft, totally normal draft board, no one is reaching on garbage players to allow super teams to be made. In fact, several of the people in the draft were sharp fantasy players. For example, or I don't have the names here, but I know that some of these guys were guys I battle in high stakes. Sometimes it's nice to draft against fellow sharp players who are far more predictable, i.e., they're not going to just spite pick an unstacked quarterback or take 10 quarterbacks, rather than drafting with the casual August crowd to win tournaments, which is another viable strategy. Maybe the strategy is you need to draft with, the people who don't know what they're doing in August. My team is listed here, and it scored 201 points week 17. It had Josh Allen and Justin Fields at quarterback, Jonathan Taylor, Aaron Jones, Damian Harris, Rashad Penny, and Jeff Wilson at running back. Had Amari Cooper, Jamar Chase, Chase Claypool, Tyler Boyd, Cole Beasley, Christian Kirk, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Diami Brown, and Marquez Valdez-Scantling at wide receiver. And at tight end, it had Noah Fant and Mike Gesicki. My team stacks included Allen to Cole Beasley, Chase to Boyd, and Jones and MVS for 6 of the 18 players. Week 17 stacks included Lions Seahawks, 2 players, Penny and Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bills Falcons, 2 players, Bengals Chiefs, 2 players, Cowboys Cardinals, 2 players, for a total of 8 of 18 players. I was ahead of the curve on game stacking in week 17. That was kind of the theme of last season. And I think it's because I helped popularize the strategy by particularly my Amon-Ra St. Brown to Rashad Penny mini stack got people buzzing about maybe this is something you need to do. Quarterback. The team used an elite quarterback in Allen and an upside mid-round player in Justin Fields. Drafting an elite quarterback allows you to draft any second quarterback. So why not roll the dice on landing another elite quarterback? The drawback is you're spending a mid-round draft pick where fantasy talent can still be found. So unlike my first team, which went Mahomes and then punted to Geno Smith, this time I went Allen and took Fields in the mid-rounds. Allen ended up smashing, and Fields did not contribute a single fantasy point to the squad all year. There is some consolation in being directionally accurate as Fields smashed the next year. Many sharp bettors balked at taking an elite quarterback in the 3rd and 4th rounds. They felt it was better to draft wide receivers and running backs and to hit the quarterback in the mid-rounds. However, on half-point websites, such as Underdog, quarterbacks contribute a higher percentage of total points than wide receivers and running backs to your score. Elite quarterbacks were being undervalued in this draft, so we took advantage. Even if they were overvalued, I felt I could outdraft the field in the later rounds. And if Allen hit a 40-point game in week 17, you were not going to find a mid-round quarterback to close that gap. It's interesting to note the fantasy market this year is pricing the elite 3 in Allen, Mahomes, and Hurts as second-round picks as of this writing. So what I'm saying here is if sharp people are saying, you know what, you can't take these elite guys, or even if they're being overvalued, if they pop off in the playoff weeks, you need to have them. And I felt like I could outdraft you guys in the later rounds. Running back. The team's anchors at running back were Taylor and Jones. Taylor was RB1 that season and one of the MVPs of the team. Damian Harris, now Buffalo Bill, was a mid-round selection, and his 15 touchdowns that season, along with his huge fantasy semifinals, is one reason the team reached the finals. Rashad Penny, a 14th round draft pick, ended up going nuclear in week 17 and the rest of the fantasy playoffs. He was an integral part of the team after putting up nothing in the regular season. Jeff Wilson was a player I invested in a lot after it was disclosed he would miss the start of the season because of injury. That gave us great playoff leverage. So Jeff Wilson, after he was injured, people stopped drafting him. I continued to draft him saying, you know what? People are not going to draft him. If he comes back mid-season, he can give me a lot of leverage. And in fact, he did in week 16. At wide receiver, the rookies and late-round picks led the way. Amari Cooper was a 3rd-round pick, and he had a good, not great season. Jamar Chase didn't scare us away despite dropping some passes during training camp. He was touted as a generational prospect, and Cincinnati was a great spot for him with Burrow. Chase was also a rookie, and they tend to score the most points later in the year when the money is made. Chase Claypool had a disappointing year as a sixth-round pick, but Boyd had a good year and produced in the fantasy playoffs. Nailing 2 late-round picks bailed the team out. Christian Kirk outperformed his 13th-round draft capital. Amon-Ra St. Brown, selected in the 15th round, provided a winning mini stack with Penny and smashed down the stretch. Diamond Brown didn't do anything all year, but Valdez-Scantling had a spike week in the fantasy playoffs, helping the team advance. Tight end. The idea was to draft 2 solid mid-round options, like Fant and Kaseki were pretty expensive, but they had disappointing regular seasons. Fant scored a touchdown in Week 17 and ended up being the top scorer at the position at very low ownership. That year, Mark Andrews was super shocked at nearly 50% ownership in the finals, so the garbage time Fant touchdown cemented the team's victory. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the similarities of my winning teams. And I put a thread of this, kind of more so in my words than the editor's words, on my Twitter. So if you haven't checked that out, at Chesleyam on Twitter. Seems like a lot of people enjoyed this, got a lot of views. Check it out. Anyways, the winning team similarities. With the breakdown of the winning teams complete, let's look at some similarities between them. 2 of the 3 teams took an elite quarterback early. The elite quarterback strategy makes sense because the market is good at ranking quarterbacks, and most of the 30 to 40 point performances come from the top quarterbacks. So it makes sense to me to take an elite quarterback and say, you know what? If a guy pops off for 40, you need to have him that week. It's probably going to be one of these 3 dudes. In each draft, team stacks and Week 17 stacks were targeted. Team stacks help with both positive correlation and negative correlation. For example, if your team stack is a good offense, more than one player can score a touchdown in a given week. Negative correlation can be equally as helpful when one player on a team can score a lot of points in the regular season or one round of the fantasy playoffs. This allows you to advance a lower owned teammate, which gives you leverage on the field. Week 17 game stacks are a big reason for winning Best Ball Mania 2. Getting a 30-point performance from Penny and St. Brown was huge for distancing the team from the field. Week 17 game stacks will also help you naturally differentiate your portfolio of players. For every team, I had players the field was not drafting, helping build playoff leverage. My winning 555 team included Trey McBride, Geno Smith, and Jalen Warren. For my 2K team, it had Geno Smith and Tyler Conklin. And for Best Ball Mania 2, it had Jeff Wilson Jr., who contributed in Week 16. Simply put, if you are drafting players the field is not, and they score a lot of points in the playoff rounds, you're likely separating yourself from the field. Every one of my teams had at least 4 receivers by the 8th round. Wide receiver, unlike running back, usually dries up early. This isn't a hard rule I follow, but it's generally easier to find usable weeks from late round running backs, such as handcuffs, than receivers. Every one of my teams had at least one running back by the 2nd round. This was a little bit surprising to me, as my portfolio teams was probably weighted towards wide receiver starts compared to the field. And then that's the end of the article there. So, all right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this read aloud. If you're going to stick around for 5 minutes or so here and answer any questions people have. So, Adam, what's going on? Tyler, thank you for the thumbnail. Love. Adam asks, Liam, what do you think about taking stance on players who you try to get in every draft if you feel strongly about him? Well, Adam, I think anyone who knows me knows that I'm a big player take guy, and I take big stands on players. For example, in Best Ball Mania 2, I had 60% Gabe Davis. Adam goes on to say, for example, I had 81% of Stevenson last year and had 37% of Henry because I was so high on both. I think it's fine to have big stands on players. It's just a variance question, right? So if you have a big stand on a player and that player gets hurt, obviously your season is going to suck. If you have a big stand on a player and that player goes crazy, you're going to have a great season. So it's just a variance thing, in my opinion. And if you have conviction I think you should do it. Um, doesn't look like we have a lot of other questions right now. So please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'll be back next week with more streams and got some articles in my brain that I want to write. So hope you guys enjoyed the read aloud today. Have a great weekend, everyone.